Hello everyone, GoldenNova here. Today's episode is a continuation of our previous episode on the agent monsters, as well as their talent agent, Hyperion. You can find that episode linked up top, but if you're all caught up, you're good to go, cause now we're going to be covering the rest of the cards that can be found around the Sanctuary in the Sky. We've got a lot to cover, so let's not do any dilly-dallying. It's time to get tallying. Today's episode is brought to you by my lovely patrons, as well as the wonderful people over at Dragon Shield. Get the sleeves as strong as dragon scales and save 5% on your order by using coupon code GoldenNova at checkout. First, let's cover an old competitive staple that ascended into having a very extensive series of cards itself, Air Knight Parshath, a level 5 light fairy monster with 1900 attack and 1400 defense that deals piercing battle damage. And if this inflicts damage to your opponent, you draw a card. Now, back in ye olden days, monsters you had to tribute summon were a big liability, cause now your opponent's removal spells were getting double value. But in a landscape dominated by scapegoats, Parshath not only provided a means to push through damage in the face of a bunch of defense position fluffballs, but also draw you some cards along the way, which could make up for any minuses you incurred by playing this. And it wasn't just helpful against the goats. A lot of good flip monsters were terrorizing the field at the time, but few could stop you from cleaving off huge chunks of life points while advancing your own game plan. Nowadays, yeah, this card doesn't cut it, but hey, that's what retrains are for. Though I am sad to say that this is easily at the bottom of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Hot Centaurs tier list. Even Bot Lamias has the weird, creepy mystique thing going on. Air Knight Parshath looks like it's someone who buys store brand because they think the packaging is cool. Nova Summoner is a level 4 light fairy monster with 1400 attack and 800 defense, and when this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon a light fairy monster with 1500 or less attack from your deck. But if the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field, you can instead special summon an Air Knight Parshath. That's right, Worst Shining Angel over here has a little extra juice that floats you into our Air Knight once we've got our field spell set up. Or nowadays, anything that shares the name. But like with all the floaters from back in the day, this one just isn't going to be making deck lists anytime soon. Only floating as a result of battle is already really tough, and even with all the extra sanctuaries in the skies that are floating around nowadays, better access to a middling card is like taking one step forward, then tumbling face first down a 50-story stairwell. But what I like least about this card is that it implies that I'm a light fairy with 1500 or less attack, and that can't possibly be right. I am, at the very least, a machine. Dark Knight Parshath is a level 5 Dark Fairy monster with 1900 attack and 1400 defense, and if this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can banish a dark monster in your grave to draw a card. And it gains 100 attack for each dark monster in your grave. Yep, we got one of those dark counterparts of famous monsters over here. Sometimes they're a huge upgrade. Dark Armed Dragon and Dark Grepher terrorized an entire format. This one, on the other hand, sucks. We lose the piercing, and to draw, we have to banish a dark from grave. It's not a free draw once we deal damage. And by doing that, you lower Dark Knight's attack because it pulls darks out of your grave, which is the thing that gives it an attack boost. Unless you have some other outside support to mobilize this, it is a strict downgrade from original Parshath and everything except the art. Now that's a good looking centaur. Neo Parshath, the Sky Paladin, is a level 7 light fairy monster with 2300 attack and 2000 defense that you can special summon from your hand by attributing an Air Knight Parshath. It deals piercing battle damage, and if this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you draw a card. So far, not too different from the original, but while the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field and your life points are higher than your opponent's, it gains attack and defense equal to the difference. So not only does it have a higher stat total than the original, it also has the Agent Mars effect. Even a small lead of just 500 makes this a staggering 2800 body, and with that piercing, you'll be able to widen that gap on every attack. Notably, you also don't need to tribute Air Knight Parshath to summon this, it's just an alternative summoning method. So if you have another way of dragging this onto the field, you'll still have access to the entirety of this card. Though, it would probably look a bit more menacing if we could get this thing out of its A pose up. Hey, can we load this thing into memory, please? We've got a video to do! Sacred Arch Air Knight Parshath is a level 9 light fairy monster with 2800 attack and 2300 defense. If you activate a counter trap card, or if you negate the activation of a spell card, trap card, or monster effect except during the damage step, you can banish 2 other fairy monsters from your hand, field, and or graveyard to special summon this card from your grave, if it was there when you activated or negated it, or from the hand, even if it wasn't. It also deals piercing battle damage, and when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can add a Parshath card or a counter trap card from your deck to your hand. This is actually a pretty sweet loadout. One of the issues that control decks can have is running out of gas, cause if you're too busy stifling your opponent's resources by trading in your own, you may not have the time to shore up your stockpiles. Arch Air Knight solves that by letting you be aggressive while rewarding you with any counter trap that you could possibly need. Now, the main problem is that you have to pay the fairy banishing cost, and sadly, fairies aren't the strongest type when it comes to loading up the grave, which sadly means you may be spending real cards from your hand or field to pay for the special summon. More modern versions of these kinds of monsters, like Darkest Diablos and Sacred Fire King Garunix, would just special summon themselves without any further hurdles, so Arch Air Knight is a bit unwieldy, but we do have a number of effects that can help turbo this out of our hand on our own terms, instead of waiting for the summon trigger to be met. In summary, it's a powerful boss that helps keep your annoying responses in stock, but it's not the easiest to get onto the board. Probably because it replaced all those glorious horse legs with a big face. Whose face is that? Whose face did we steal for this? Why are we stealing faces? Avenging Knight Parshath is a level 8 light fairy synchro monster with 2600 attack and 2100 defense, requiring a tuner and 1 or more non-tuner light monsters as material. Once per turn, you can target a face-up monster your opponent controls and change its battle position, and like most Parshaths, it deals piercing battle damage. This was actually one of the first synchro monsters ever made, and it occupied a very interesting niche during those early days. As a level 8 synchro, it fought for extra deck space with Stardust Dragon, Red Dragon Archfiend, and Thought Ruler Archfiend, and all of those were completely generic. But if you had some good light non-tuners, which admittedly were in short supply, they actually contested all 3 of these monsters, since you could just turn them sideways with Avenging's effect and pierce through. And while Red Dragon Archfiend was good at dealing with a field of defense position monsters, Avenging Knight doesn't punish you for not attacking with any particular monsters. It would get overshadowed pretty quickly, but it was a pretty fun alternative for a time, especially if you couldn't get your hands on these more powerful synchros. In fact, it's almost good enough to forget that Avenging Knight Parshath looks like its body is made completely of crumpled up tinfoil. Celestial Night Lord Parshath is a Link 3 light fairy monster with 2400 attack, requiring 2 or more fairy monsters as material. You can discard a card to add a The Sanctuary in the Sky, or a card that specifically lists it in its text, from your deck to your hand. But if the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field, you can add a fairy monster instead. And if another face-up fairy monster you control is sent to the grave except during the damage step, you can banish a fairy monster from your grave to special summon a fairy monster from your hand whose level is higher than the banished monsters. That's some pretty spicy effects, especially in the context of some monsters we just covered. Banishing any level 8 or lower fairy can bring out Arch Air Knight, along with any other big fairies that are stuck in your hand. If you can trigger this during your opponent's turn, any artifacts that you drop out of your hand will trigger their effects, and both Dark Lords and Time Lords are huge enough to benefit from just about any banish. Remember, Time Lords can't be special summoned from the main deck, but the hand is totally fine. And being a repeatable source of hand fixing for all of your Sanctuary in the Sky cards is a great way to make sure you have what you need at any given time. Though I feel like we've transitioned from vaguely angelic imagery to something more Nordic. Look at all the horse legs on this guy. I'm starting to think that this is going to turn into Lopter at any given moment. The Sanctum of Parshath is a continuous spell card whose name becomes the Sanctuary in the Sky while on the field or in the grave. Fairy monsters on the field gain 300 attack and defense, and set spell and trap cards cannot be targeted by or destroyed by card effects. And once per turn, you can target a total of 3 fairy monsters and or counter traps with different names in your grave and place them on the top of your deck in any order. The little stat boost is pretty nice, though not overwhelming. But the best part is that it keeps your back row all nice and snug. Getting those outed before they can fulfill their purpose is pretty rough, especially if they have very narrow applications so you can't chain them for any value. Sanctum keeps your opponent from sequencing their destruction in a way that minimizes their impact. and helps to keep you stocked up on that kind of interaction by putting your monsters and counter traps into your deck. But there's a catch. The problem with stacking cards on top of your deck means that your draws are as determined as it gets, and both you and your opponent will know this, which kinda ruins the whole element of surprise thing, as well as disincentivizing you from using this if you're desperate to grab some non-engine during your draw phase. Now, this can combo very well with search effects, because it'll shuffle the top of your deck back into your deck to keep up the mystery. And if we keep up the offensive with Sacred Arch, we can ensure that happens on a consistent basis. Just be careful about where you set your set spell and trap cards. With the revealing light coming out of that sanctum, they're bound to get flipped up eventually. Rebirth of Parshath is a counter trap card that can be activated when a spell card, trap card, or monster effect is activated. Reveal a counter trap in your hand, then discard a card and pay 1,000 life points to negate the activation, and if you do, shuffle that card into the deck. Then, you can special summon a Parshath monster from your deck or extra deck. This has got to be one of the most expensive counter traps in the game, at least in regards to how many kinds of things you have to even activate this. The idea is that you're supposed to play this alongside a piece of Counter Fairy support that we'll get into next section, but there's one thing we can't get around: revealing the counter trap in our hand, which means you're not deploying it to help shore up your board. Now, Rebirth being an Omni negate means it covers just about anything another counter trap can do, but even if it has better usages, you're still down a card that you could be using to cover another point of interaction. However, the trade-off is that you get one of your Parshath monsters on the field for free. At the time, the Sacred Arch version was probably your best target, but the Link isn't half bad either as long as you need to deploy some fairies out of your hand. But even at its cheapest, it's more difficult to use than most other counter traps. And because this didn't exactly take over the competitive landscape after release, you can probably guess this didn't result in the kind of rebirth the theme was looking for. With Parshath completed, we get a little peek at the concept of the Counter Fairies. While not a specific archetype in and of themselves, they all focus on counter trap cards, and many actually tie back to the Sanctuary in the Sky. So let's take a look at these annoying Avengers. Bountiful Artemis is a level 4 light fairy monster with 1600 attack and 1700 defense, and each time a counter trap card is activated, immediately after it resolves, draw a card. This is kind of like the beating heart of the Counter Fairy strategy, turning all of your counter traps into cantrips. Remember when I said it was rough out there for control decks to keep up the gas needed to interact with the opponent effectively? Well, now we have a card that basically replaces all of those interactions with a fresh card when you use them. And with counter traps like Solemn helping you to keep those threats off the board so they don't run over Artemis, there's a good chance it'll be sticking around for a long time. But don't get too gung-ho about it. You wouldn't want to use Bountiful Artemis so much that people start actually putting a bounty on you. Guiding Ariadne is a level 4 light fairy pendulum monster with 1700 attack and 800 defense and a scale of 3. As a spell card, you don't need to pay life points nor discard cards to activate counter traps, and if this card is destroyed by a battle or card effect, you can reveal 3 counter traps from your deck, and your opponent chooses one of them to add to your hand, and shuffle the rest into the deck. This is the card that's meant to work with Rebirth of Parshath, making it so you only have to reveal that counter trap for cost. But it also works alongside a number of other cards. All of your Solemns now become free to activate, and while the discard counter traps have largely fallen by the wayside, it did help one in particular: Ultimate Providence. Like Invoked Mechaba, you would normally have to discard a card of the same type of what you wanted to negate, monster, spell, or trap card, but by bypassing that cost entirely, it just turns into an Omni Negate, which is pretty funny. It also played a showcasing role in Performage Pendulum decks, as another scale that could help perform a pendulum summon while searching out powerful counter traps the deck would use to solidify its board states. An effect that could be triggered multiple times in a turn because it lacked a once per turn clause. It's an amazing start to the Guiding archetype, though I'm still trying to figure out how Quem factors into all of this. Harvest Angel of Wisdom is a level 4 light fairy monster with 1800 attack and 1000 defense, and when this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the grave, you can target a counter trap card in your grave and add it to your hand. Guess Guiding Ariadne wasn't the first counter fairy floater out there. Getting back any of these disruptive devices can really gum up your opponent's plays, but as with most battle destruction floaters, it's just not anything. Thankfully, this has been the benefactor of a dark retrain, Harvest Angel of Doom. A level 4 Dark Fairy Pendulum monster with 1800 attack and 1000 defense with a scale of 8. As a pendulum spell, during your main phase, you can destroy this card, and if you do, add a Black Horn of Heaven from your deck to your hand. And as a monster, if this card is normal or pendulum summoned, you can add Horn of Heaven from your deck to your hand. And if this card is tributed, you can place this card in your pendulum zone. So, as a quick reminder, Horn of Heaven is a counter trap card that, when your opponent would summon a monster, you can tribute a monster to negate that summon and destroy it. And Black Horn of Heaven is a counter trap card that can be activated if your opponent would special summon a monster. It doesn't require a tribute, but it can't hit normal summons. So we've got a really neat cycle where you can normal summon this to get Horn of Heaven, tribute Doom Angel for that card's effect, this puts it into the pendulum zone, then you can pop it to get Black Horn, then pendulum summon it back later for another Horn of Heaven. And it's also a nice little reference to how both Harvest Angels have a kind of Horn of Heaven. Wisdom may not be particularly useful nowadays, but when Doom is combined with Guiding Ariadne, you've got a Pendulum duo that gives you a suite of counter traps that are sadly nerfed by the fact that Pendulum zones have to share space with the rest of your spell and trap zones. That's pretty rough, but with how impressive the counter trap Pendulum lineup was, the Harvest team really is reaping what they sowed. Layard the Liberator is a level 4 Light Fairy monster with 1400 attack and 1500 defense, and each time a counter trap card is activated, immediately after it resolves, add 2 of your banished fairy monsters to your hand. This is a little weird because not a lot of fairies are actively being banished, though we do have Hyperion and Majesty Hyperion, so it's not totally unheard of. It's in a similar vein to Bountiful Artemis, where it adds benefits to your counter trap activations, but it's not as impactful as just drawing a card. You may find you're getting a lot of value out of this if you've stuck Banisher of the Light or Radiance onto the board, but aside from that, you may find your banish pool a bit shallow, which means we're going to need to find other things for these 6 hands to work on. I don't suppose anyone out there needs help carrying the groceries in right now? Meltiel, Sage of the Sky, is a level 4 Light Fairy monster with 1600 attack and 1200 defense, and each time a counter trap card is activated, immediately after it resolves, gain 1000 life points. And if you do, if the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field, destroy a card your opponent controls. This is probably one of the best counter trap augmenters out there, second only to Artemis. Only gaining the 1000 life points though is pretty dry, but adding in that removal? That's messed up. I'm looking forward to a future where this actually gets played on a regular basis, because getting to deny your opponent a play and taking their lunch money is fantastic. Resolving enough of these is enough to make your opponent's game plan completely melt. Yell. Minerva, Scholar of the Sky, is a level 4 Light Fairy monster with 1700 attack and 400 defense, and each time a counter trap card is activated, immediately after it resolves, this card gains 500 attack. And if it does, and the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field, add a counter trap card with a different name from your grave to your hand. This one's also a banger, full stop. It's not even once per turn. It gets stronger the more you resolve your counter traps, with even a single one getting you up to 2200, so you don't have to worry about this getting run over super easily. And it helps keep your arsenal topped up once the Sanctuary in the Sky has been deployed. Which makes sense, teachers are usually more effective when they have somewhere to teach. Unfortunately, the classes are all on back row war crimes, so it's been hard getting funding. Power Angel Valkyria is a level 4 Light Fairy monster with 1800 attack and 1050 defense, and if you negate the activation of a spell card, trap card, or monster effect, you add a Light Fairy monster from your deck to your hand. This one's a bit more flexible because it doesn't have to negate directly from a counter trap, so something like a Ghost Bell can actually trigger this too, but not Ash Blossom because that negates the effect, not the activation. Make sure to check your fine print, folks. And that's good because now you can grab the monsters that modify your counter traps to really slather on the value. It even has a pretty good stat line to help it stick around long enough for you to get one of those negates going. But, you know, that makes sense because this card is actually a retrain of an older monster, Dunamis Dark Witch. Good thing they dropped the dark part of the name. That was getting pretty confusing considering it's always been a light monster. Radiant Gerald is a level 4 Light Fairy monster with 1000 attack and 2000 defense, and when this card is sent to the grave, except if destroyed by battle, gain 1000 life points if the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field. Oh, wow, this card has a mess of design issues that I cannot wait to pick through. The good news here is that it does have a 2k booty, so for a normal set, that's pretty good. Bad news, it only gets the effect when it leaves the field if the Sanctuary of the Sky is out and about, and it can't trigger if destroyed by battle, so that's one way to avoid that even if the effect is live. Just about the only saving grace we have here is that that effect is mandatory, so we can link this off, and we get a little extra life point bonus for our troubles, but that's not nearly enough to help with our life point matters effects. Radiant Gerald is out here like it showed up for barrier statue training and just didn't read the syllabus correctly. We're stopping summons here, Gerald. We're not trying to be Aeromage's 17th worst card. Come on. Voltanus the Adjudicator is a level 8 light fairy monster with 2800 attack and 1400 defense, and after one of your counter trap cards has been activated and resolved, you contribute all monsters you control to special summon this card. And if special summoned this way, you can destroy cards your opponent controls up to the number of fairy monsters you tributed. That's a pretty interesting decision, trading in your monsters for removal, which lets your counter traps do the one thing they normally can't, actually break an established board. But we have to have a fair amount of fairies on hand to actually accomplish this, and the amount you tribute isn't optional, it has to be all or nothing. Not to mention that if you're playing anything off theme, all non-fairies do not count towards that destruction count. Voltanus doesn't even take them out of the wrapper, they just throw it right in the garbage. How wasteful. Honestly, I'm much more of a fan of its dark counterpart, Dark Voltanus. It's a level 8 dark fairy with 2800 attack and 1400 defense, and after a counter trap card you control has been activated and resolved, you contribute a dark monster to special summon this card from your hand, and if special summoned this way, destroys a card on the field. See? Same activation conditions, smaller cost, and while the reward is smaller, it is still a piece of non-targeting removal. Not to mention that it's having a lot more fun with it than the original. I think the dark counterparts really are just built differently. Synthetic Seraphim is a continuous trap card that special summons a Synthetic Seraphim token each time a counter trap card is activated immediately after it resolves, and those tokens are level 1 light fairies with 300 attack and defense. Now, Voltanus the Adjudicator looks a lot more reasonable when all the monsters you're tributing are tokens, and in the modern era we love tokens for their abilities to help build up a board. But an advantage generator that's this passive isn't going to help you pop off, especially since you can sneeze on these tokens and they get blasted away. Good to see that Counter Fairies release spores in the presence of counter traps though. Learning their mating habits is going to be really big when it comes to predicting future support. Okay, now that we've had our vegetables, it's time for the dessert. While only very slightly related to the Sanctuary in the Sky, there was a monster that released in the same set, and it's hard not to talk about it when this subject comes up. Warrior of Zera is a level 4 Earth Warrior normal monster with 1600 attack and defense, a wandering warrior who seeks the Sanctuary where he can gain the power of the Archlords. To escape the temptation of evil fiends, he fights solo day by day. And it has a lot of spin-off cards. In fact, it has so many and that are so different from one another that there are good argument for them being split across different timelines. But since Yu-Gi-Oh has a bunch of different dimensions, multiple timelines isn't that far-fetched. First up, let's go over the timeline where Zera actually gets to the Sanctuary and achieves Ascension. Archlord Zerato is a level 8 light fairy monster with 2800 attack and 2300 defense that can't be normal summoned or set, and can't be special summoned except by tributing a face-up Warrior of Zera on your side of the field while the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field. And if the Sanctuary is on your side of the field, by discarding a light monster from your hand to the grave, you can destroy all monsters on your opponent's side of the field. But if you don't have the Sanctuary in the Sky on your side of the field, this effect isn't applied. So if your opponent chains removal to get rid of your Sanctuaries, then no Raigeki for you. A very unwieldy boss monster, but once it's on the board, it puts in some work. It even got itself a Dark Retrain, which might actually be a way to tie Zerato in as a member of the Dark Lord archetype. It's a level 8 Dark Fairy monster with 2800 attack and 2300 defense, and if you have 4 or more Dark monsters in your grave with different names, you can tribute summon this card by tributing 1 Dark monster. You can also send a Dark monster from your hand to the grave to destroy all monsters your opponent controls, but once per turn during the end phase, if this effect was activated this turn, destroy it. So it's way easier to deploy than original Zerato, letting you even special summon it on top of having a way to discount its tribute summon, but you do lose it if you go for the Raigeki. Though if you're about to close out the game, then it won't much matter. But that's not all the Zera we have up in the Sanctuary. There's also Zeradius, the Herald of Heaven, a level 4 light fairy monster with 2100 attack and 800 defense, and you can discard this card to the grave to add the Sanctuary in the Sky from your deck to your hand. And if the Sanctuary in the Sky isn't on the field, destroy this card. This is one of the field spell searching monsters that were so popular back in the day, but Zeradius, much like elemental hero Captain Gold, has the downside of exploding if you're not on their home turf. Zeradius probably has it worse though, because at least if you have Captain Gold on field, it benefits from Skyscraper's effect to get over anything bigger. The Sanctuary in the Sky, basically being a vanilla field spell, just keeps your life points safe, which isn't very useful in combat. Still, it's a pretty kickin' normal summon, but if you want some real power, you're gonna want to check out Angel of Zera, a level 8 Light Fairy Synchro monster with 2800 attack and 2300 defense, requiring generic material. This card gives 100 attack for each of your opponent's banished cards, and during the standby phase of the next turn after this card was banished, special summon this banished card. A neat inclusion for any deck that expects to be banishing a ton of cards, since this will just keep coming back over and over again, and get stronger the more cards you banish. So the more you feed Hyperion and Jupiter, the more buff this card gets. Speaking of buff, it's also got a massively different rendering than the originals, and gives off the vibe of those what if X was in real life kind of images that people do sometimes with Pokemon or anime characters. Each muscle is carved out in fine detail, and I'm both impressed and frightened. A perfect combination for the biblically accurate Zera. But now we have to branch off into a different timeline, because while Zera can find ascension in the Sanctuary, he could also give in to the temptation of those fiends, creating Mazera Deville, a level 8 Dark Fiend monster with 2800 attack and 2300 defense that also can't be normal summoned or set, and cannot be special summoned except by tributing a face-up Warrior of Zera on your side of the field while the field spell Pandemonium is on the field. And if Pandemonium is on your side of the field when you special summon this card, your opponent discards 3 random cards from their hand. But if Pandemonium is not on your side of the field, this effect is not applied. Yeah, this is a hand rip for 3! Granted, you have to be running Zera and the Chess Archfiend field spell, so good luck running this card in any deck that actually has prospects of winning, but boy howdy is it going to catch some people off guard when you manage it. I expect I'll have a lot more to say about this in the eventual Archfiend Explained episode, pray for me on that one, but if this ever gets even remotely viable to summon, this will be a problem for formats that can't absorb the discard well. And this is just one half of the deadly duo. You've seen Ma Zera Deville, just wait until you see Pa Zera Deville. In another timeline, Zera actually has a second Fiend transformation, though is much different from the Archfiend one. Zera the Mant is a level 8 Dark Fiend Ritual monster with 2800 attack and 2300 defense that can only be ritual summoned with the ritual spell card Zera Ritual, which itself is your old standard ritual spell fare. Ritual summoning Zera the Mant by tributing monsters from your hand or field whose total levels equal 8 or more. Since the Mant resembles the sword that Zera carries, I think this path represents the warrior's unfailing dedication to fighting alone, and after seeking more power, eventually becomes the weapon they sought to master in their previous life. Which is pretty cool, but since this never got its own follow-up, there isn't really much to talk about here. Hopefully we get some kind of Zera set in the future where we can revisit this, but for now, you've got plenty of time to hash things out with your alternate timeline selves. That therapy session is gonna be weird. And we thought Visas was gonna be out of this world. Oh, I suppose we're not done yet though? We randomly have a zombie world variant, Al Ghul Mizera. It's a level 8 Earth zombie monster with 2800 attack and 2300 defense, and if any number of zombie monsters you control would be destroyed by a battle or card effect, you can banish this card from your hand or grave instead. And if this card is banished, you can special summon this card in defense position, then you can reduce its level by 1. Which is nice for level modulation. It's not actually out of left field for zombies at all. They love synchro summoning. More importantly, it's a free body that you get after using the protection effect, which is pretty solid. And now we get to add a whole new field spell to the continuity. Never change, Zera, just keep being your indecisive self. We'll find a canon ending for you eventually. Alright, that's all the Sanctuary in the Sky info I have for you, but what do we do with them? Well, when it comes to Counter Fairies, we really just need a good mix of powerful counter traps and monsters to support them. Solemn Judgment is currently at 3 at time of recording, and that's a big buff since it hits just about anything in the game. So looping your Solemn lineup while keeping your resources topped up with cards like Guiding Ariadne and Athena is gonna be imperative. As for agents, we'll need as much fuel as possible to get our big monster combos off the ground. That way we can push through boards with Hyperion, do things we aren't supposed to do with Lynx, and otherwise be a general nuisance to our opponent by leveraging a number of annoying fairy cards. So what can we play to help them out? No matter what version you're running, the Heralds are always a good investment to give you more stopping power. Going for all the rituals may be a bit overkill, but Orange Light is a great complement to almost any hand, giving you more assurance that your plays will go through, while giving you another way to stifle your opponent. Sadly, its best companion Eva is currently banned in the TCG, so you won't get to pitch it alongside Orange Light to recoup the cost, but that's just how things go. Mirage Light is also a pretty accessible link too if you find yourself in need of some quality spell and trap negation. But the premier option has to be Diviner of the Heralds. This can send Trias Hierarchia, which can tribute the Diviner to summon itself, which will in turn summon out a tiny fairy, with DD Sprite and Buten being the best options since they're level 1 tuners. That and the level 9 Trias Hierarchia makes 10 levels, and while Barone is banned, we can still make Bestial Dispater, and now you have a banished Trias to use with its effect. Notably, Buten can also turn one of your level 4 and lower fairy monsters into a tuner, which can help bridge the gap between certain plays if needs be. Speaking of good level 10 synchros, since we're on all lights, if we can line up 10 levels, we can also make Chaos Angel, which represents 1 banish and is unaffected by your opponent's activated monster effects. But if we have to use actual tuners, another really good one is Sword Soul Supreme Sovereign Cheng-Ying. With Majesty Hyperion, we're already banishing cards out of our opponent's graveyard, so this just layers it on with some extra removal. Not to mention the huge buff and debuff that it lays out on the field once you've got it online. Part of the issue with some of these decks is that it's just hard to get the monsters onto the actual field, but there's a new core of cards that can help you with that, and just so happens to line up with much of our support. Melodious. Refrain's normal summon can get you Couplet, which you can activate in the Pendulum scale to search out Concerto. Fusion summon using Refrain and Couplet to make Baka, and proceed doing more melodious nonsense. The important part for us is that our fusion materials from the extra deck will reset themselves in the scale, giving you a range of 1 to 9. The only restriction here is that you're not able to Pendulum summon anything that's not a light monster, which does catch on some of our monsters, but most will be able to leap out of your hand ready to rumble. As for some silly tech picks, Guiding Ariadne isn't the only way we can cheat the life point costs of our counter traps. Dinomorphia Stealth Bergia is here to help pick up the slack, so why not give your control strategy a bit of an oomph by splashing in the rest of the high-tech prehistoric pugilists. Many of their trap cards have effects in grave that help keep your life points safe, Kentragina can help turbo out your threats like it's nobody's business, and Rexsturm is a nasty monster floodgate that also helps to keep your opponent's monster's attack low so your monsters don't get punished for it in battle. And the idea of playing a light fairy dark dinosaur deck sounds really funny to me. As for the agents, it has to be Ma'at. We have plenty of light fairy monsters to send to grave for its summon, and any 2 spare monsters can pull Protector Whelp of the Destruction Swordsman from the extra deck. The key to maximizing this card's potential is with Sanctum of Parshath, because it literally puts 3 cards of our choice on top of our deck, so every turn we can call the 3 set using its effect, add them all back to your hand, thus negating the downside of that card, and it gains 3,000 attack, 1,000 for each correct card. Pull this off, and you will literally have used the avatar of the Millennium items in a game. That's just too peak to pass up. Alright, that does it for our cards, but how do they stack up against the Nova scale? At least insofar as the Agent and Parshath cards go. Trying to rate Counter Fairies is like trying to put Stun on the Nova scale, so I'll pass. Novelty. Era Mages may take the current title of the deck that wants to weaponize life points by stockpiling them like their nuclear arms, but Agents got to the party first. And while I wouldn't say that either of them are particularly successful at it, Agents didn't really stick with it the same way that Era Mages did. The Angels basically left the groundwork for the Era Mages to work on. As for the rest of the theme, while a legendary Ocean did help spur the Umi-centric group of cards before Sanctuary, thus being one of the first to set up that kind of precedent, Sanctuary was among the first to start including cards that counted as it in multiple zones, to try and fix the problem of being so reliant on it, something that Umi would then eventually adopt as we would see in the Mako Tsunami cards. So really, I've got to give it points for that, even if the rest of it does just feel like another type-specific resource engine. These cards get a 3 in novelty. Objectivity. While the play lines can be long and complicated, I don't see these decks pulling off anything actually broken. The closest thing we have is being able to summon out Christia as a fairy deck, but one monster floodgate that doesn't have any kind of protection is pretty outable in today's format. If anything, the decks are due to be pushed a little further because what they're doing now is not exactly testing the boundaries of what the game can do. It's got a little bit of everything, but they aren't going to be really good at any of it until they start picking some kind of specialization, so they're getting a 5 in objectivity. Versatility. Several of our cards can work with the broader fairy pool. The problem is that they tend to require the Sanctuary in the Sky to actually accomplish this. Granted, I do think that can actually be a boon to many of these decks, with Fallen Sanctuary giving some much needed monster interaction at a cheap cost while providing you with a powerful counter trap for later turns. But I can't remember the last time I saw any fairy deck trying to splash these in. So it's in that you can run these, but would you want to run these grouping, so we're gonna have to give these cards a 2 in versatility. Awesomeness. Updating agents, and especially Parshath, is an uphill battle, because you're trying to update decks that were around before the concept of a pendulum summon even existed. Hyperion used to be the value engine of kings, a budget boss monster that had removal coming out of its ears and was a free summon out of your hand with just one little agent monster. Now you're lucky if it hits field more than its Majesty Retrain. The newer cards are certainly powerful, but until we get cards that turbo out the Sanctuary in the Sky even faster and more consistently, and maybe even gives it some bonus effects, this mishmash is pretty haphazard. It's not the worst defender of this tripping over itself too much syndrome, but enough for me to put these cards at a 4 in awesomeness, meaning the agents and Parshath get a 14 out of 20 on the Nova scale. And that about does it for this big gaggle of cards. I know these are a pretty big favorite amongst older players, and I can see why. Easily accessible while leveraging some pretty out there effects, there's a lot of creativity to be found there amongst the clouds. And if we keep clamoring for more support, I'm sure we'll get some kind of nonsense involving the moons or more dark versions of these monsters. Because if they know they can make money out of them, then their interests, much like these planets, will surely align with our own. But now, I want to hear what you all have to say. Is the Sanctuary in the Sky about to command respect from on high, or is Umi still the field spell that's making waves? And which one's your favorite? I gotta say, they really killed it with Agent of Destruction Venus's design. Do not get on this lady's bad side. Let me know your favorite down below, and if you haven't already, please be sure to like the video if you liked it, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and share this video with somebody you know who loves Yu-Gi-Oh! It really does a lot to help me out. Today's episode is brought to you by my lovely patrons, as well as the lovely people over at Dragon Shield. Get the sleeves as strong as dragon scales and save 5% on your order by using the coupon code GoldenNova at checkout. Today's episode was also brought to you by my lovely patrons, including this month's illustrious Quasar Commanders, the Critic of Innocence and Upstairs Media, Nebula Navigators, 3rd Dynasty, Ada Basilisk, Adam Zajdel, Owexatoa Hime, Anansi Dragon, Kane Senpai, Chibi Gohan, Christopher Fuss, Clockswork, Comrade Copperbottom, Emony Chan, Eric, Frankie, Garland Chaos, Green Knight, Gloomba 331, Great Big Pillock, Groog, Hairbear, Harry the Ominous Benefactor, Howling Zangetsu, Iron Zero, Iskander 711, Carp, Mana Charge, Marion James E. Picata, Megacombi, Millennia Asta, Muzuki Clark, Nathan Vig, Natiel Lee Alexander, Orozco 09096, Panther J, Rebel King Lucifer, Red Eyes Jackalow, RJ the Jank Monarch, Sammy Haim, Scott 48, Serenity Towns, Skybuster Leo, That One Dumbass, Thievery Coast and the Wizard Moose, Cosmic Crusaders Alpha Sly, Almento 5010, A Random Pup, Ariel Kersey, Beelzephyr, Baron Von Titty Sprinkles, Beluga Master, Bernag, Blitzwolf, Blue Gem, Borger with a Shotgun, Chaz Ghost, Childish Lamar, Dr. Reaper R.I.P., Drachenwald, Eki Bullock, Eva Padilla, Fabrizio Orpianesi, Hike Boyagian, Herbal D, Ignis Heath the True Draco Slayer, Jester Designs, Kale the Dragon, Kevon Public, Lemon Yu-Gi-Oh!, Lobomaru02, Manga Pages, Matt Simmons, Mick Spoofy, Michael Shimabukuro, Nitromo, Obsidian, Ramen Resurrect-chan, Shizuka Nijimura, Sophie, apparently, Stephen Williamson, Taylor Seymour, Terror Top to 3, Tiger X 2476, The Pokemon 52, The Legendary Raven, and Zaldreka, as well as all the lovely Starlight Explorers you see on screen now. If you'd like to help me in my journey to cover all of Yu-Gi-Oh's archetypes, get my videos early, be a part of these credits and other awesome perks, it would mean the world to me if you checked out the link to my Patreon in the description or consider joining as a YouTube member. And if you missed the first part of this two-parter, be sure to catch up with our good friends the Agents right here. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Remember, Time Lords can't be special summoned from the main deck. Wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey stuff, unrelated. But the hand is fine. Every time this comes up, I want to make a Doctor Who reference, but it doesn't work without it being completely out of left field. There's no way to weave in Gallifrey into any of this.